Today I'll be painting on something a bit unusual. These are plastic lids that I make for paint storage units, and I had a few set aside to paint as galaxy designs. This seems to be where most of my galaxy art is going these days, which is pretty cool because it means that the painting gets to be appreciated way more by whoever ends up owning this palette than if it just was done in some sketchbook and lived on a shelf forever. Plus, in general, these palettes are just a nice opportunity to do all of these smaller galaxy paintings while using a medium that I don't typically use, acrylic paint. Although I will say, I'm not entirely sure how good of an idea it was to have like a paint with me using galaxies or nebulas as the main topic of the painting, because these tend to look absolutely insane and ridiculous until like the last second when you start adding the stars. So for now, there's going to be a bunch of these like crazy colored clouds, but I guess I hope you enjoy seeing how something goes from looking admittedly ridiculous to something that looks legitimately like outer space. I wanted to try out a bit of a different process to see if it would make my painting faster, so I went and actually applied the paint in blobs to the lid itself and then worked at blending it together and out, just because galaxies and nebulas are such an abstract design. Like, they really don't have much structure, and the structure that you end up giving them comes in layers, and so generally you're just trying to get the color down in the different areas and blend it together so that it looks smooth in areas and just give it interesting dimension and shape. And so I thought that maybe putting the paint on the palette itself might be an interesting process, might make things a bit faster, which I don't know if it really did. I think the first problem was that I put way too much paint for the palette that I had, so a lot of it was I was pretty much just waiting for the paint to dry so that I could work at blending the more tacky paint out. But I did eventually get it to work and look good, so I guess it was a worthwhile experiment, even if I'm not entirely convinced it was faster at all or if I'll do it again. I worked on all of these lids over a couple of days in between other work that I was doing, and as you probably saw at the beginning of this video, I did end up using my wet palette, which I absolutely am obsessed with and love using it for these palettes, specifically as it is sort of the only time I'm consistently working with acrylic paint on a piece. And the wet palette keeps the paint beautifully for the most part. The one difficulty that I was having was because it had been so long since it was sitting on the palette. It had gone overnight sitting on there a couple of times, I believe, and so some of the colors seem to have absorbed a little more water than they probably should have, so they started to get a bit more sheer, which I was fighting with a little bit, but overall it wasn't too bad, especially because I was layering up colors and mixing a bunch of different ones together, so I could bring back the consistency to something that it should have been. But you might notice as I've been painting some of these that the acrylic paint itself looks quite translucent, and other than just some of the colors are more translucent than others, that was also a reason, was it had absorbed probably more water than it should have, but it was still workable. I still made it work. I think the end result still looked perfectly fine. It was honestly kind of an okay thing because it meant that I wasn't applying paint that was so thick you would see it later. These lids do get resined, so if there was any slight inconsistencies in the texture or leveling of the paint on it, it would fill all of that in. It's self-leveling resin, but you do want the overall paint application to physically look quite smooth with not extreme like hills and valleys of thick paint. You might have noticed that as I've been painting these that I really haven't switched out my brush like at all. I'm pretty sure I only used this flat brush and then a smaller filbert brush, other than the toothbrush for the acrylic ink and the stars. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that all of these I only use the two brushes, and I tried to switch them out as little as possible. I really just wanted to keep everything as fast and loose as I could, and in the past I have basically stuck to the one brush for painting galaxies on these lids, and it's worked out perfectly fine. The flatter brushes mean that I can cover a lot of area really easily with the more broad side, but then use more of the corners and tips to just create more detail in the central cloud sections. The last step, of course, was to actually add the resin to these lids once the paint had dried, and here are the finished palettes. These are available right now in my store if you're interested in picking one up. The link will be in the description box. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.